The desert air hung heavy, the setting suns casting an orange glow over the barren expanse. Scott adjusted his breather mask, his boots crunching against the gritty surface as he made his way up the ridge. Behind him, Geron was a steady presence, calm, focused, and always a step ahead when it came to figuring things out. They'd been working together for years, and though Scott would never admit it, Geron's quiet confidence often held the team together. "You think it's going to be as easy as they said?" Scott muttered, glancing back. His voice was muffled by the mask, but Geron caught the edge of uncertainty in it. "Never is," Geron replied. He reached the crest of the ridge first, lowering himself into a crouch as he scanned the horizon. "This place gives me the creeps. They've got technology we barely understand, and we're supposed to sneak in and grab it without raising any alarms. You tell me if that sounds easy." Scott grunted, crouching beside him. "Still better than last time. Remember the shipment run on Obris?" "Don't remind me," Geron said. "My back still aches from lugging those crates. This time we're dealing with lab equipment. Could be worse." Scott's lips twitched in a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The two of them had a way of getting through tough spots, complaining their way out of trouble as much as anything else. From their vantage point, they could see the alien facility, a gleaming structure of metal and glass that seemed out of place in the desolate landscape. The main entrance was well lit, a handful of figures moving in and out. Most were members of the station's staff, dressed in flowing, multi-layered garments that shimmered under the artificial light. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical. Scott couldn't tell if they were unusually disciplined or just didn't have the same kind of nervous energy humans carried. "Look at M," he murmured. "Like clockwork." Geron gave a short nod. "That's going to make it harder for us. They won't slip up, not easily. You got a plan. Get inside, find the lab, grab the tech, get out," Scott said. "You know the drill." "Sure. Just as long as we don't have to run into any of their security droids. You know how those things like to shoot first." They began their descent, keeping low to avoid being seen from the facility's upper windows. As they got closer, Scott noticed the faint hum of machinery. The structure seemed alive in a way, its panels and lights shifting patterns that made his head swim if he stared too long. He couldn't help but wonder what exactly they were after. Their higher-ups never explained much. It was just another job. At the side entrance, they found a maintenance hatch just like the intelligence had said. Geron worked quickly, his fingers flying over the alien keypad, bypassing the locks. Scott kept watch, his hand on the compact laser rifle strapped to his side. "Almost there," Geron muttered. "Good," Scott replied. "I'd rather not have a welcoming committee." The lock clicked, the hatch hissing open. Inside, the air was cooler, sterile. The corridor was lined with faintly glowing strips along the walls, and the smooth flooring seemed to absorb sound rather than amplify it. Geron checked the device on his wrist and motioned left. They moved silently, their footsteps swallowed by the strange material beneath them. "Lab's supposed to be 3 levels down," Geron whispered. "We take the maintenance shaft." "Not the elevators?" "Elevators have cameras. Maintenance shafts don't." Scott couldn't argue with that. Geron's knack for detail had saved their hides more than once. They found the maintenance shaft and descended, hand over hand, into the lower levels. The sound of their breathing seemed louder in the confined space, each movement deliberate and careful. If they made a sound, they risked alerting someone or something. When they reached the lab's floor, they emerged into a dimly lit corridor. The hum of machinery was louder here, along with faint voices from further down the hall. Scott and Geron exchanged a glance, then moved cautiously toward the source. The door to the lab was ajar, and from their position they could see the silhouettes of 2 aliens inside. One of them seemed to be explaining something to the other, their gestures fluid and expressive. "Let's wait until they leave," Geron whispered. "We'll slip in, grab the core, and get out before anyone notices." Scott nodded, settling into position to wait. But as the minutes dragged on, he couldn't help but feel that something was off. The aliens weren't leaving, and their conversation grew more animated. When one of them walked toward a console near the door, Scott stiffened. If they saw him, the whole mission could go sideways. But Geron, as always, remained calm. He signaled for Scott to hold position, his eyes scanning the room for a solution. And that's when they noticed something strange. A third figure, partially obscured behind the lab equipment. It wasn't human. It wasn't like the other aliens, either. It was something else. Scott frowned. "What is that?" "No idea," Geron replied, his voice low. "But it's not what we were told to find." "What do we do?" "We stick to the plan," Geron said. "But be ready. If it moves toward us, we deal with it." Scott didn't like the sound of that, but he trusted Geron. For now, they'd stick to the mission and hope that dealing with it wouldn't mean more than a quick escape. Chapter 2. The encounter. Geron and Scott crept closer, their boots silent on the smooth alien flooring. The strange, multi-jointed figure behind the console hadn't moved yet. It was humanoid, but its proportions were off. Slender arms that bent at unusual angles, and a long neck that made its movements unnervingly fluid. Scott whispered, "Think it's one of them?" "Could be a researcher," Geron replied softly. "Could be something worse." Scott's grip tightened on his rifle. "What's worse than the guards upstairs?" Geron shot him a look, not knowing what's coming next. "Focus. We're here for the core. Stay sharp." They eased into the room's shadowed corner, their movements deliberate. The alien scientists were still talking, something about containment protocols, from what little Geron could make out through the universal translator clipped to his ear. The third figure, the one that had drawn their attention, stood by a lab bench, adjusting equipment that hummed faintly. "This is too clean," Scott muttered. "We waltz in, wait for them to finish chatting, and then what? What if that thing sees us?" Geron pulled out a small device and tapped a few buttons. "The moment they leave, I'm locking down the lab's security systems. Then we grab what we came for. And if they don't leave?" Geron's expression darkened. "Then we adapt." Scott clenched his jaw. He hated when Geron said, "adapt." It usually meant something was about to go sideways. As they watched, one of the researchers stepped closer to the odd figure, handing it a data slate. The figure hesitated, its movements smooth but oddly tentative, almost like it was unsure of itself. Geron frowned. "That's not normal," he whispered. Scott rolled his eyes. "Which part?" "The way it moves. Doesn't act like a guard or a researcher. More like someone who doesn't want to be here." Scott gave him a skeptical look. "You're reading way too much into this. What matters is if it's going to turn around and blow our cover." Before Geron could respond, the figure turned toward them. Its large, dark eyes scanned the room. For a brief moment, Scott felt his heart drop. He raised his rifle slightly, but Geron grabbed his arm. "Wait," Geron hissed. "It hasn't seen us." "How can you tell?" "Because it's looking at the exit." Scott followed its gaze. The figure didn't seem interested in them or the scientists. Instead, it glanced at the lab's main door, hesitated, then returned its attention to the data slate. Scott still didn't lower his weapon, but he nodded. "Fine, we wait." The researchers continued their work for several more minutes, oblivious to the two humans hiding in the shadows. Finally, the lead researcher said something that the translator didn't quite catch, and the group started packing up their equipment. Geron watched carefully as the odd figure handed back the data slate, its hands moving with that same unnatural grace. "Almost time," Geron said. "When they're out, I lock down the lab. And if that thing stays?" Geron paused, then muttered, "We'll figure it out." The researchers exited the lab, leaving the third figure behind. It stood motionless for a moment, then turned back to the console and started typing rapidly. Geron and Scott exchanged a glance. The situation had just gotten more complicated. "I thought you said they'd all leave," Scott whispered. "I thought they would," Geron replied. "Now we're in uncharted territory." Scott gritted his teeth. "What's the play?" Geron took a deep breath. "We approach carefully. See if it's hostile. If not, we might get what we need without a fight. And if it is hostile, Then we go loud, Geron said, pulling his own rifle from its holster. But only if we have to. They moved slowly toward the figure, keeping their weapons trained. The closer they got, the more Scott could see its features. The creature's skin was smooth and faintly reflective, with intricate patterns that almost seemed to shift in the low light. Its movements were fluid, but its posture suggested nervousness, not aggression. When they were just a few meters away, Geron spoke up. "You don't have to turn around," he said in a firm, calm tone. "We're not here to hurt you." The figure froze. Its hands hovered over the console, and its head tilted slightly. After a moment, it spoke in a soft, musical voice. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." Scott frowned. "No kidding. That's why we're leaving as soon as we get what we need." Geron stepped closer, lowering his rifle just enough to seem less threatening. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just need the core and we'll be gone. What about you? You don't seem like the others." The figure finally turned. Up close, its large eyes reflected the dim light, giving it an otherworldly appearance. "I wasn't supposed to be part of this. I was brought here, trained for something I never wanted to do." Scott and Geron exchanged a look. Geron asked, "What do you mean?" Before the figure could answer, the hum of the lab systems grew louder. Red lights flashed along the walls, and a voice in a language Scott didn't understand boomed over the intercom. The figure stiffened, looking toward the door. "They're coming back," it said. "We have to go. Now." Geron nodded. "Fine, but you're coming with us." Chapter 3, The Chase. "We can't just walk out the front door," Scott hissed. He was crouched next to the mysterious alien figure, Syrah, as she'd introduced herself, while Geron kept watch. "Those guards will gun us down before we make it 10 steps. Syrah's luminous eyes darted toward the corridor. "There's a secondary access tunnel. It's not on the official schematics, but I've used it before. I can get us there." Geron glanced over his shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Show us. Fast." Syrah hesitated, her long, spindly fingers hovering over the console she'd been operating moments before. "If I go with you, I'll be hunted by my own people. If I stay, you don't have much of a choice," Geron said. "You can come with us and have a chance, or stay and deal with whatever that alarm's bringing down on us." Scott smirked faintly. "That's Geron speak for get your ass in gear." Syrah's lips curved into a slight smile, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Fine. Follow me." The three of them moved quickly and silently through the winding corridors. The walls were sleek, smooth, and dimly lit by strips of blue light, casting eerie shadows. Scott felt his pulse quicken as distant echoes of boots reverberated through the passageways. They weren't alone anymore. "You said you know another way out," Geron pressed. "How far?" "Not far," Syrah replied, her voice just above a whisper. "But we'll have to pass through a secure checkpoint. I might be able to bypass it, but..." "Might isn't what I want to hear," Scott interrupted. "Either you can or you can't." Syrah stopped abruptly, spinning around to face him. "Do you want me to help you, or not?" "Keep your voice down," Geron snapped. "Both of you knock it off." Scott scowled but fell silent. Syrah turned and continued leading them. The sound of heavy boots grew louder, and Scott felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "We're running out of time," he said. "They're close." Syrah led them into a narrow maintenance shaft, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. "It's just ahead," she whispered. "This will bring us to a loading bay. We can find transport from there." "You sure there's no one waiting at the loading bay?" Geron asked. His tone wasn't accusatory, just calm, steady. He had a way of keeping things grounded. "Not if we get there first," Syrah said. Scott grumbled under his breath, but followed without further complaint. The maintenance shaft opened into a larger chamber filled with what looked like storage containers. The air was cooler here, the hum of machinery quieter. "We can take one of the transport pods," Syrah said, pointing to a small, sleek vehicle at the far end of the chamber. "Good idea," Geron said. "Scott, keep watch." Sira, you... A loud, metallic clang interrupted him. A panel to their left burst open, and two alien guards emerged, weapons drawn. Get down! Geron shouted, yanking Sira behind a stack of crates. Scott raised his rifle, firing off a quick shot that ricocheted off the guard's armor. The aliens returned fire, blue energy bolts slamming into the crates and sending up bursts of sparks. We don't have time for this, Sira hissed, crouching low. No kidding, Scott snapped, his back pressed against a container. Any bright ideas? Sira pointed to a panel on the far wall. I can trigger a release that will flood the chamber with smoke. It'll give us enough cover to reach the transport. Go, Geron said, firing off another shot. Scott and I will keep them distracted. Sira hesitated for only a moment before sprinting toward the panel. Geron and Scott laid down cover fire, their shots forcing the guards to take cover. The chamber echoed with the sharp cracks of gunfire and the heavy clangs of boots against metal. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, a loud hiss filled the chamber as thick, gray smoke poured from hidden vents. Visibility dropped instantly, and Scott could barely make out Sira's faint outline waving them toward the transport pod. Time to go, Geron shouted. He and Scott sprinted toward the vehicle, ducking under erratic blue bolts from the guards' weapons. The smoke provided just enough cover, their movements hidden in the swirling haze. Scott threw himself into the transport, followed by Geron and Sira. Get us out of here, he yelled. Sira hit a sequence of buttons on the console. The pod's engines roared to life, and they shot forward, leaving the smoke-filled chamber and the pursuing guards behind. The silence inside the transport was deafening after the chaos of the firefight. Scott leaned back, letting out a long breath. That was too close. Geron nodded, his face unreadable as usual. You handled it. Scott shot him a glance. You too. Sira's hands were still on the controls, her expression tight. We're not safe yet. They'll track us. We'll figure it out, Geron said simply. His tone wasn't reassuring or comforting. It was just matter of fact. Let's just get some distance. Scott looked at Sira, his voice softer now. You okay? She hesitated, then gave a small nod. For now. Scott leaned back in his seat, his rifle resting on his lap. Well, for now's better than nothing. Chapter 4, The Bond. The transport hummed quietly, its smooth trajectory carrying them far from the research station. Scott adjusted the straps of his gear, glancing at Sira in the pilot's seat. She was focused on the controls, her elongated fingers dancing across the panel with practiced ease. Geron was at the back, checking their remaining supplies and scanning the area with a handheld tracker. We've got at least an hour before their long-range sensors can lock onto us, Geron said. We need to make that time count. Do we even have a plan yet? Scott asked. Or are we just playing it by ear? We'll figure it out as we go, Geron replied. We always do, Scott grunted. That's your plan? Wing it. Better than panicking, Geron said coolly. Now start thinking ahead. If we get separated, where are we meeting? What's our fallback? Sira turned slightly in her seat, her eyes flickering between the two men. There's a neutral zone on the edge of the system, a trading hub. No one would dare start a fight there. It's bad for business. And they won't think to look for us in a place full of people who don't ask questions, Geron said. Sounds good to me. Scott rubbed his temples. Fine. Neutral zone it is. But how do we get there without them finding us? I'll chart a course through a debris field, Sira said. It'll mask our signature long enough to slip past their patrols. Smart, Geron nodded. Scott, keep watch on the rear sensors. I'll set up our supplies so we're ready if things go south. Scott muttered under his breath but moved to the sensor console. The screen displayed a swirling mass of fragmented rock and metallic shards, the debris field Sira had mentioned. It looked like a labyrinth, but he trusted her to navigate it. Hey, Sira, Scott said after a few minutes of silence. Why are you so good at this? Flying, dodging, knowing where to go. I didn't exactly have a choice, she replied without turning her head. I was trained for situations like this, staying off the grid, avoiding detection. You could say it was part of the program. Program? Geron asked, glancing over his shoulder. Sira hesitated, her fingers momentarily still. I was chosen for a special project. They taught me everything I needed to survive. But it wasn't just about staying alive. It was about completing their goals. I didn't always agree with those goals. Scott leaned back in his seat, processing her words. Sounds like you didn't have much of a say in the matter. No, she admitted. Not at first. But now I do. Geron looked at her thoughtfully. Well, you're not the only one who's had to follow orders they didn't like. Scott smirked faintly. You saying you didn't enjoy all those supply runs to backwater outposts? Somebody had to do it, Geron replied evenly. A faint smile touched Sira's lips. It sounds like the two of you have been working together for a long time. Long enough, Geron said. Scott and I don't always see eye to eye, but we've got each other's backs. That's what matters. Scott chuckled. That's his way of saying he likes me. Don't push it, Geron warned. Though his tone was light, the atmosphere in the transport eased slightly, the tension of the last few hours giving way to a quieter, more companionable mood. Sira seemed more relaxed, her movements less rigid as she guided them through the treacherous debris field. Scott watched her for a moment, then leaned back, folding his arms. You know, I've got to admit, he said. I wasn't sure about bringing you along, but you're not half bad. High praise. Oft hum of the transport and the distant glimmer of the debris field filling the cabin. Even Scott, who rarely let his guard down, found himself relaxing in their shared presence. Chapter 5, The Truth. The trading hub was a sprawling network of interconnected structures floating in the middle of nowhere. As their transport docked, the bright neon lights of the station's outer ring reflected off the craft's polished surface. Scott scanned the bustling corridors ahead, which swarmed with all manner of life forms. Traders, smugglers, and travelers moved purposefully, their voices blending into a constant hum. Geron leaned against a bulkhead, his arms crossed. No fighting allowed here, right? Sira nodded. They enforce that rule strictly. Anyone caught causing trouble is immediately removed. No exceptions. Scott squinted at a trio of broad-shouldered aliens hauling crates. Yeah, well, doesn't mean we won't get a knife in the back the moment we turn around. That's what I'm here for, Geron said, smirking faintly. To keep you from getting yourself killed. I feel so reassured, Scott muttered. The three of them stepped off the transport and onto the station's wide concourse. The place was enormous, filled with towering stalls, glowing signboards in dozens of languages, and the heavy scent of exotic spices and industrial lubricants. Geron led the way, his eyes sharp, scanning the crowd for anyone who looked too interested in their arrival. Sira kept close to him, her long stride matching his, while Scott took the rear, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. You said you have a contact here, Geron said over his shoulder to Sira. Someone who can help us disappear. Sira hesitated. I have someone I can talk to. They can get us access to a secure hangar. But it's not a guarantee. Scott rolled his eyes. Great. Another gamble. Everything's a gamble out here, Sira replied evenly. You don't survive long if you can't adapt. Geron gave her an approving glance. She's got a point. They moved through the bustling corridors, dodging a group of insect-like merchants arguing over a shipment of rare minerals. Finally, Sira stopped outside a small, dimly lit establishment tucked into the corner of a quieter section. The sign above the door displayed an unreadable script, but Sira seemed to recognize it. Here, she said. He'll be inside. Who is he, exactly? Geron asked, his voice low. A former researcher, Sira replied. He left my people's hierarchy years ago. He knows how to stay off the grid, and he's helped others disappear before. Let's hope he's in a helpful mood, Scott said. They stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. The room was crowded with small tables and a low bar along the back wall. Conversations buzzed in a half-dozen languages, and the air was thick with the smell of something sweet and smoky. Syrah scanned the room until her gaze landed on a figure sitting in the corner. A wiry, blue-skinned alien wearing a tattered cloak. He looked up as they approached, his narrow eyes narrowing further when he saw Syrah. "You brought company," he said, his voice like gravel. "They're with me," Syrah replied. "I need a favor." The alien's thin lips curled into a faint smile. "You don't usually ask for favors. What's changed?" Geron stepped forward, his stance casual but firm. "She saved our asses. Now we're trying to return the favor by keeping her alive." The alien's gaze shifted to Geron, then to Scott. "Humans, huh? You must be desperate, Syrah." "I don't have time to argue," Syrah said. "Can you help us or not?" The alien leaned back, studying them carefully. "I can get you into a secure hangar, but after that you're on your own. And I'll need something in return." "Of course you do," Scott muttered. "Name your price," Geron said evenly. "Information," the alien replied. "I know who you are, Syrah, and I know you were part of something important before you went rogue. I want to know what you took with you." Syrah's expression tightened. "That information could get me killed." "Then you're out of luck," the alien said. "It's the price of disappearing. Take it or leave it." Geron glanced at Syrah. "Your call." Syrah hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. I'll tell you, but only after we're secure." The alien smiled again, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "Deal." They left the establishment and made their way through the hub's maze-like corridors. Geron walked beside Syrah, his voice quiet. "You're not seriously going to tell him, are you?" "I'll give him something," Syrah said. "Enough to keep him happy, but not enough to put me, or you, at risk." Scott shook his head. "I hate dealing with these types. Always one hand out, ready to stab you with the other." "That's the way it works out here," Syrah said. "You learn to play the game, or you don't survive." "Well, I hope you're as good at bluffing as you are at flying," Scott muttered. "Otherwise, we're screwed." Geron smirked. Always the optimist. They reached the secure hangar without incident, the alien's instructions proving accurate. As the heavy doors sealed behind them, Geron turned to Syrah. "Now that we've got a moment, what exactly did you take? And why is it so valuable?" Syrah hesitated, then looked at them both. "It's not just what I took, it's what I know. I was working on a project that could redefine how our species interacts with others. A way to bridge the divide between civilizations." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Sounds a bit grand, don't you think?" "It wasn't about grand gestures," Syrah said. "It was about understanding. About finding a way to coexist without more running and hiding," Geron finished for her. "Or fighting." Syrah nodded. "Exactly." Scott sighed. "I still don't trust that guy. If he sells us out, then we deal with it," Geron said calmly. "One step at a time." Syrah met his gaze. "Thank you." Geron shrugged. "We're all in this together now. Might as well try to make it work." Chapter 6. The Betrayal. The heavy doors of the secure hangar sealed shut behind them, muffling the noise of the trading hub's bustling corridors. Scott leaned against a wall, his rifle resting against his shoulder, as Geron and Syrah went over their next steps. The tension was palpable, and Scott's patience was wearing thin. "How do we even know that guy's not going to sell us out?" he asked. Geron gave him a calm, level look. "We don't. That's why we need to move fast. The longer we're here, the more likely it is someone notices us." Syrah was focused on the small device she'd taken from the transport, her long fingers carefully adjusting its settings. "We don't have many options. This is our best chance to get the information out without being tracked." Scott exhaled sharply. "Great. Love the sound of that best chance." "Relax," Geron said, his voice as steady as ever. "You're still breathing, aren't you?" Scott rolled his eyes but stayed quiet. He hated the waiting game, standing around while Syrah calibrated equipment he barely understood. Every second felt like an invitation for their enemies to close in. After a few minutes, Sira straightened. It's ready. Once we activate it, we'll have about 30 minutes before the signal becomes traceable. That's our window to find a new transport and disappear. 30 minutes? Scott said. That's cutting it close. It's the best we've got, Sira replied. Unless you know a better way to scramble a long-range sensor array, this is what we're working with. Geron stepped forward, nodding. She's right. We hit it fast and keep moving. No room for mistakes. Scott threw up his hands. Fine, fine. Just don't say I didn't warn you if this all goes to hell. Before anyone could respond, the hangar's doors hissed open. All three of them spun toward the noise, weapons raised. A tall, imposing figure stepped inside, flanked by a pair of armed guards. Scott recognized the insignia on their uniforms immediately, human intelligence operatives. Geron, the lead operative said, his voice calm but cold. Didn't think we'd find you here. Gaines, Geron muttered, lowering his rifle slightly. Should have known you'd show up. Scott looked between them, his confusion evident. What's going on? Geron's jaw tightened. He's with my old unit. Looks like they've been keeping tabs on us. Gaines stepped closer, his guards holding their weapons at the ready. You've gone off mission, Geron. That's a problem. But I'm willing to let it slide if you hand over the alien. He gestured toward Sira. Sira's grip on her device tightened. I knew it was only a matter of time before your people caught up. Scott took a step toward Geron, his voice low and urgent. We can't let them take her. You know what they'll do. Geron didn't reply immediately. He kept his gaze on Gaines, weighing the situation. Finally, he spoke. And if we don't hand her over? Gaines smirked. Then things get messy. But you don't want that, do you? Geron didn't flinch. You've got no authority here, Gaines. This is neutral territory. That won't matter once we leave, Gaines said smoothly. You know how this works. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. Scott moved to stand by Sira, his weapon still trained on Gaines. You're not taking her. Gaines raised an eyebrow. You'd go rogue over this? Over an alien? Scott's voice was firm. She's not just some alien. She saved our lives. And what's that worth? Gaines asked, his tone cold. You think that changes anything? We have orders for a reason. Geron stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge. Orders aren't always right, Gaines. You know that better than anyone. There was a brief silence, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Then Gaines sighed. Fine, have it your way. But don't say I didn't give you a chance. He raised his hand, and his guards opened fire. Scott ducked behind a crate, returning fire in quick bursts. Sira crouched low, shielding the device she'd worked so hard to prepare. Geron moved methodically, picking off one of the guards with a precise shot. We need to get out of here, Sira shouted, her voice strained but steady. No kidding, Scott yelled back. Geron's focus never wavered. He gestured toward the far side of the hangar. There's a maintenance shaft over there. Go! Scott covered Sira as she ran, firing at the remaining guard. Geron followed close behind, his rifle still trained on Gaines. We can't let them follow us, Geron said as they reached the maintenance shaft. Sira, get that device activated now. Scott, help me seal this shaft once she's through. Scott nodded, his frustration giving way to determination. He and Geron worked quickly, moving a heavy crate into place as Sira input the final commands into the device. The sound of approaching footsteps told them they didn't have much time. Got it, Sira called. Go, Geron shouted. The three of them disappeared into the shaft just as Gaines and his reinforcements arrived. The last thing Scott saw before they sealed the entrance was Gaines' face, twisted in frustration. Think he'll give up? Scott asked as they descended deeper into the station's lower levels. Not a chance, Geron said. But he won't catch us. Not if we keep moving. Sira glanced back, her expression thoughtful. I didn't expect you to stand up for me, either of you. Don't make a big deal out of it, Scott said, still catching his breath. We're not out of the woods yet. Geron nodded. But we'll get there. Chapter 7: The Connection. The dimly lit tunnel stretched out ahead of them, a series of interlocking maintenance passages that wound through the bowels of the trading hub. Syrah led the way, her movements smooth and deliberate. Geron followed closely, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. Scott brought up the rear, his rifle at the ready. "Any idea how long this goes?" Scott muttered. Syrah glanced over her shoulder. "Long enough. We'll surface near an old docking bay. No one should be there." Scott scoffed. "No one except whoever's hunting us." "Enough," Geron said firmly. "We stay quiet, stay focused. We're not out of this yet." The group moved in silence for a while, the faint hum of the station's systems echoing around them. Scott's grip on his rifle tightened as he kept glancing behind them. The walls were close, the air cool, but the tight quarters made him restless. After several minutes, Syrah stopped abruptly. She raised a hand, motioning for them to halt. "Something's ahead." Geron stepped up beside her. "What do you see?" "There's a slight energy reading," Syrah replied, her voice low. "Could be a patrol, could be a sensor. Hard to tell from here." Scott rolled his shoulders, his tone impatient. "Well, we're not getting anywhere standing here." "Give me a moment," Syrah said. "I can reroute the signal. If it's a sensor, I'll trick it into thinking the corridor is empty." Geron nodded. "Do it." "Scott, cover her." Scott positioned himself a few feet behind Syrah as she crouched near a junction box, her nimble fingers working quickly. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, scanning for any movement. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, but he ignored it, focusing on the slight hum of Syrah's tools. Geron stood back, watching the rear. "Any luck?" he asked. "Almost there," Syrah replied. "Just a few more, got it. The signal's been rerouted. It'll look like no one's been through here in hours." Scott exhaled sharply. "Good. Let's keep moving." They continued on, the passageways twisting and turning in a maze-like pattern. Syrah moved with purpose, and though Scott still had his doubts, he couldn't deny that she knew her way around. Every so often, she'd pause to check a panel or adjust a conduit, ensuring their path stayed clear. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel finally opened into a larger chamber. The room was dark, filled with stacked crates and dormant equipment. Syrah motioned for them to stop again. "This is it," she whispered. "The docking bay is just beyond that door." Geron approached the heavy door, running a hand over the control panel. "Looks secure. No signs of recent activity." "Then we're clear?" Scott asked. "For now," Syrah said. "But we need to move quickly. This is the last place they'll look for us, but that doesn't mean we can stay long." They crossed the chamber quietly, stepping over stray cables and avoiding the cluttered piles of machinery. Syrah led them to an old service terminal tucked against the wall. She activated it, the screen flickering to life. "What now?" Geron asked. "I'm checking for a transport that hasn't been logged," Syrah said. "We need something that won't be missed. If I can find one, we'll have a way out." "And if you can't?" Scott asked. Syrah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were locked on the screen, her hands moving quickly across the console. After a tense moment, she straightened. "There's a small maintenance shuttle. It's not much, but it'll get us out of here." Scott glanced at Geron. "Small shuttle. That's not exactly reassuring." "It'll do," Geron said. "Anything that gets us off this station is fine by me." Syrah locked down the terminal and motioned for them to follow her. They passed through another narrow corridor, finally reaching a dimly lit docking bay. The maintenance shuttle was as unimpressive as Scott had imagined. A boxy, utilitarian craft with scorch marks on its hull. "This thing doesn't look like it's going to hold together," Scott muttered. "It's sturdy," Syrah said. "It just hasn't been cleaned up in a while." "Great," Scott said dryly. "So we're flying in a dirty tin can." Geron smirked. "Better than being stuck here." Syrah keyed in the access code, and the shuttle's hatch creaked open. The interior was cramped, with barely enough room for the three of them. As they climbed inside, Scott scanned the small cockpit and the jumble of equipment strewn about. "Well, it's no luxury cruiser," he said, but I guess it'll have to do. It will, Syrah said, taking the pilot's seat. She began running pre-flight checks while Geron secured their gear. Scott dropped into one of the passenger seats, his rifle resting across his lap. Are we in the clear now? Scott asked after a moment. Not yet, Geron replied, but we're close. Once we leave the hub's sensor range, we'll have more breathing room. Breathing room, Scott repeated with a scoff. I'll believe it when I see it. Syrah looked over her shoulder, meeting Scott's gaze. I know it's been rough, but we're getting through this. Just a little longer. Scott held her gaze for a moment before nodding. All right, I'm counting on you. Chapter 8. The Resolution. The shuttle's engines purred steadily as it broke free of the station's gravity field, angling toward the emptiness of deep space. Scott stared out of the viewport, his hand resting on his rifle. The twinkling stars and distant nebulae offered a fleeting sense of calm, but his mind was still racing. Geron leaned against the bulkhead, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the cockpit readouts. What's our next move? First, we get clear of the system, Syrah said, her voice steady as her hands flew over the controls. Once we're out of their range, I have coordinates for a safe haven. It's a small refueling station just inside a neutral zone. Scott frowned. Neutral, huh? Like the trading hub was supposed to be. This place is quieter, Syrah replied. No prying eyes. No questions. Geron nodded. Sounds like a good start, but it doesn't solve the bigger problem. Scott shifted in his seat, looking back at Geron. What problem is that? The fact that we're still a target, Geron said. Syrah's people want her back, and our own are after her too. We can't just keep running forever. Syrah turned her chair slightly, meeting Geron's gaze. I know, but if I can share what I know with the right people, it might change things. That's why I left in the first place, to get this information into the right hands. To show that things don't have to stay the way they are. And how do you know these right people will actually help? Scott asked, his skepticism evident. Syrah hesitated. I don't. But doing nothing isn't an option. Geron looked thoughtful. If we're going to take that chance, we'll need more than just words. We'll need proof. Something solid that shows it's worth the risk. Syrah nodded. The data I have isn't just theory. It's results. Practical applications that can bring different species together. Trade agreements. Medical advances. Things both sides can benefit from. Scott raised an eyebrow. You're saying this isn't just some idealistic dream. You've got hard evidence. I do, Syrah said firmly. But it's scattered. Locked away in different places. If we can retrieve it, we'll have a case that's impossible to ignore. And you know where to find it? Geron asked. Yes, Syrah said. But it won't be easy. Some of it's in highly secured locations. We'll have to be careful. Scott leaned back, crossing his arms. Careful hasn't exactly been our strong suit so far. Then maybe it's time to start, Geron said, his tone even. We plan this out. We move carefully. No unnecessary risks. Syrah gave a small smile. That's the kind of thinking that's going to keep us alive. Scott snorted. You think we're all just going to walk into these places and waltz out with your files? It's not that simple. I know it's not, Syrah said. That's why I need you too. You've already PR. Yeah, I'm in, Scott grumbled. Somebody's got to keep you two from getting killed. Syrah turned back to the controls, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly. Then we'd better get started. The shuttle's trajectory shifted, the engines powering up as Syrah guided them toward the coordinates she'd mentioned. The stars streaked by, their course set. For the first time in what felt like forever, their path was clear, even if the journey ahead was full of uncertainty. Together, they'd face whatever came next.